to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, Interview with a Survivor, our hosts, Lucky and Tim, will be discussing near misses, problem projects, and resolutions. In today's episode, Greg Ryder shares his story about the design, construction, and eventual arbitration for a support-of-excavation project located between a roadway and a railway line.
Welcome back to DFI's podcast, Broadcasting Common Ground. I'm Lucky Nagarajan, and I'm here with co-host Tim Siegel. Hi, Tim.
Hi there, Lucky.
This is the third episode in our series, Interview with Survivor, where our guests share their experience when problems arise, which is inevitable, right? Today, our guest is Greg Ryder. Greg is the president and CEO of Berkel and Company Contractors. Hi, Greg. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, Lucky. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Greg. Lucky, you may not know, but Greg and I worked together at Berkel in the years prior to his role as CEO. Greg is always thoughtful when trying to solve a problem. He takes his time and he tries to look at multiple angles. That's a rare quality. In contrast, I think most of the time we see only our own positions, and then conflicts arise because the situation becomes polarized. Greg is a perfect guest for this series. Because of his rare gift of being kind of a peacemaker, I know that he is involved when things get difficult on a project.
That is very unique position to be in, I would say. Also, not for all, right? This episode is a bit of a departure from our previous two in our Survivor series. So in this episode, the failure, if we can call it that, didn't directly involve the practice of engineering. It was about the contractual side of our business, which is very important as well. But before we jump into the project, Greg, could you tell us a little bit about your professional career and also your new role now at Berkel?
Sure. So I've been with Berkel since 1999. Prior to that, I worked for Geohydro engineers there in the Atlanta area. Left Geohydro and went to work for Berkel in their Atlanta office, and progressed from a field engineer to project manager to assistant regional manager, and then had the opportunity in 2009 to relocate to Kansas City in our corporate office and work with Alan Roach, our previous president and CEO. And Alan retired about 3.5 years ago, and I took over at that point.
Greg, let's set the stage for our listeners. This project is an existing roadway on a hillside in the Midwest that runs parallel to a railroad track. There were four main players in our story today: the DOT, the general contractor, the railroad, and Berkel and Company Contractors. I understand that Berkel was bidding to construct a soil nail wall on the downhill side of this existing road. The soil nail wall was designed by the DOT. What complicated the project was that the railroad had its right-of-way very close to the downhill edge of the pavement. The DOT identified this in their bidding documents and required that the successful bidder protect the railroad right-of-way with temporary shoring. So if our listeners can imagine, the purpose of the soil nail wall was to allow the installation of underground utilities adjacent to the existing roadway, but the railroad right-of-way prevented the excavation from being daylighted in the hillside. So in fact, the DOT had envisioned a contractor-designed temporary system on the railroad side of this temporary trench. Do I have it generally correct?
Yeah, no, that's a good description. In one way, it would have been a very easy job, a very easy soil nail job if it were not for the restricted access. And the restricted access was all driven by the fact that the adjoining property, as you said, downhill from the roadway, was owned by the railroad, and there was about a 15-foot wide easement where the construction work downhill from the roadway was allowed to take place. But otherwise would have been a very straightforward, very easy soil nail job. But given the constraints, that's what made it difficult.
So Greg, was this originally planned to be a design build contract between Berkel and general contractor?
No, originally it was as Tim said, it was designed by the DOT, and we simply bid the design that the DOT put out for bid. So yeah, not originally.
Greg, I think I've heard several folks, but I think I may even have heard you say a few times, when you enter in a design bid build contract or pursue one like this project, you call it playing the dumb contractor. And I know that's a really kind of a little, it's not really being literal. That means something. What is it when you say that term, or when others say that term?
To us, it means you're simply taking on the responsibilities of a contractor. You're simply going out there to build what somebody else has designed. So you go into it with a little different mindset, in that you're not carrying the risk for, the design working. Obviously, you're not carrying the risk for it necessarily being constructible. So it's a little different mindset than if you own the responsibility of the design itself.
I got you. So when you say that, what it does, it kind of puts some of the risks. You mentioned the risk that the design performs well, and the risk that the design is constructible. It kind of places those risks appropriately on really the designer, in which in this case is the DOT,
Right.
as opposed to on Berkel, where, on other projects, Berkel is the designer. They're the design builder. And you would take on more risk in the design build scenario.
That's correct.
Okay.
I think it is key to note that this point in your story, it was understood that Berkel, general contractor, and the DOT had aligned goals, right? At least as far as you knew. All three of you wanted to install a soil nail wall or something similar to that. And of course, it had to be on schedule and within the budget. Right, Greg?
Yep. No, it probably as with most projects at the beginning, everyone's goals were aligned. So yeah, complete the work on time and within budget. That was what everybody had in mind at the beginning.
If you think about all the players, general contractor, DOT, and Berkel, you were the subcontractors. So how was the chemistry in terms of looking at the project and looking at the schedule and also looking at the budget?
Chemistry was fine. We would have been fine installing the original design as planned. Being that we are also a design build subcontractor, we oftentimes will bring, ideas to the table to a project, whether or not we actually take on design responsibilities or not. If we see that there's potentially a better way that can save some time or save some money, or provide a better project for the owner. We do that quite often.
Greg, so as y'all moved, let me just ask you this. When you worked initially on the project, did you move right into the contract phase, or was there an extended period of time as you guys kind of developed your team together and back and forth with you and the GC?
I think initially after we bid the project and started having discussions with the apparent low bidder, the general contractor. We were not signed up immediately under contract, and part of that was because a discussion ensued about whether or not the as designed soil nail wall was indeed the best approach, and whether or not there were other ideas that could be utilized to support this roadway and save some time and maybe save some money, particularly as it related to the need for the temporary shoring to protect the railroad's property.
And that's not uncommon, right? In our market today, a set of plans hit the streets, people bid it, and then suddenly there's this hub of activity, almost like a beehive of trying to everybody finding a better way to do something, everybody or trying to find a lower cost, better schedule, or a better fit, right? I mean, I'd say
that's pretty typical. Once you have players that are formally involved in a project, it's quite common for all sides to kind of put their heads together and once there's a team in place and figure out if there's some efficiencies to be gained by looking at it a little differently.
So in terms of the general contractor, Greg, was this general contractor someone new to Berkel, or was this general contractor someone who Berkel had done previous projects with?
We had done a little bit of work for them previously, not a long-standing history by any means, but I think we had done 1 or 2 projects with them prior to this job. Nothing of this size, some smaller work, but we had a little bit of a history with them.
So, Greg, as I understand it, you and your colleagues at Berkel did offer an alternative to the soil nail part. So the DOT designed the soil nail wall, and you moved to provide a different type of retaining system to replace that soil nail, right?
Yeah, so the DOT's design was a soil nail wall, and they had specified 4 levels of soil nails, and that's where the difficulty, as you can imagine, came into play. So the first and second tier of soil nails probably would not have been that difficult, but once you get down to the third and fourth tier, say 20, 25 feet below the top of the roadway, you're into a very narrow trench situation without this temporary shoring to protect the railroad's property. So what our guys came up with was an alternate using an H-pile, soldier beam and lagging wall with a single layer of tieback anchors to provide lateral support. So the concept was, with 1 level of tiebacks, you would limit the access requirements for a drill rig to get in there and install whatever kind of ground anchors, whether it's soil nails or tieback anchor. So the beauty of the plan was, we'll have 1 row, we'll keep the rig up high and minimize the access requirements that would be required, once you got down to the second, third, and fourth levels of excavation.
Sure. And for maybe some folks that aren't as familiar with, soil nails, right? They're spaced about every 5 feet. So you can imagine that, and they're probably like 2 or 3 feet off the bottom of the excavation. So that's pretty deep compared to a tieback, maybe in the upper 1/3 of the excavation.
Right.
So
right.
There's a big advantage. Was there also a schedule advantage in addition to access advantage that you had on this?
Yeah, we believe that the soldier beam and lagging tieback option would have reduced our schedule, and I think it would have also allowed the general contractor, who had follow-up work behind us, right? This job was much bigger than just simply a retaining wall. The ultimate goal here was for this retaining wall to allow the roadway to be reconstructed because it was in pretty bad shape due to deterioration of the hillside. So they had some follow-on work with the roadway repaving and all of that had to take place afterwards. And we felt like going this route would allow their work to follow on and start sooner potentially, as opposed to waiting for the entire soil nail wall to be complete.
Very good.
Greg and Tim, it's time for our sponsor break. Specrete is a grouting and concrete additive company with an emphasis on the deep foundation industry, probably best known for their water retentive additives for auger cast piling. Specrete has used their knowledge of underground grouting and concrete to create unique problem-solving products for many deep foundation applications, including high mobility grouting applications, pumping of low strength grouts, and a system of products to meet the new Deep Foundation Institute and EFFC guidelines for Tremi concrete. Thank you, Specrete, for sponsoring this episode. We have John Anderson from Specrete, who is the president and owner. John has been involved in concrete admixtures and concrete-related products since 1979, when he went to work for Master Builders a long time ago. He has been running Specrete for over 25 years and is the current chair of DFI's Manufacturers, Suppliers, and Service Providers Committee. John, it's great to have you here. And John is a very good friend of mine. And welcome to this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucky. And thank you, Tim, for suggesting that we sponsor this episode. It's really been a good experience. I thought the first interesting topic might be the connection between Specrete and Berkel and Company. I'll start by saying that at one time, Specrete was known as the Concrete Chemicals Division of Intrusion Prepack. And I was hoping Greg could share a little bit about Mr. Berkel's history and his start at Intrusion Prepack.
Yeah, so Mr. Berkel worked for Intrusion Prepacked early on in his career in Chicago, and at some point they sent him to Kansas City to run a regional office for Intrusion Prepacked. And lucky for the rest of us, at some point he decided that he wanted to go into business for himself and decided to launch Berkel & Company Contractors, Inc. Here in Kansas City, and has grown it into what it is today. But yeah, definitely some Intrusion Prepack connections from back in the day.
The other thing, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to tell a little story, and Tim's familiar with this one, and I'm pretty sure Greg too. There was we were supplying additives, grout fluidifiers for auger cast, but I'm not sure we totally understood everything we were trying to do. And I was learning the business, and went out on a project where Berkel was out in Arkansas and having difficulty getting cages to drop into the grout. And Tim was there and I was there, and we were struggling looking at it. And the thing that really came out of that job for us was that Mr. Berkel really encouraged us to solve the problem. And he said to me that if we solve this problem, we're not only, helping Berkel & Company, but really helping the whole industry. And, it really became our goal over the next couple of years to really solve that problem. And it became the issue of water retention that Lucky mentioned in the introduction. And Greg, obviously, Mr. Berkel is a big influence on me, and I'm sure on you. And I just wondered if you could share some other things that, might be similar to that, where he influenced other people or or brought around processes that might have improved because of what he saw out there?
Yeah. So when he got into the augered pile business, there was no equipment shop down the street that you could go rent or buy augered pile equipment from in order to get into business. So he saw the kind of the brilliance in the augered pile technique, and he thought there was something there that would take off and become a really strong pile type across the country. And he pushed the envelope, with what equipment was available at the time. And as pile depth started to get deeper and pile diameter started to get larger, and existing equipment that was somewhat available at the time was no longer, big enough, strong enough to take care of what needed to be drilled, he decided the only step forward was to start manufacturing that equipment on his own. So that's how we got into manufacturing auger pile equipment and tooling. And it was all out of necessity. He didn't have time, if we had a piece of auger break back in the day, he didn't have time to wait for a supplier that didn't have any on hand to bring us more. So he wanted to become self-sufficient, and he really approached kind of all aspects of the business in that way. And nowadays there's plenty of opportunities for people to rent and buy equipment and tooling, but that's probably the biggest thing is developing the auger pile across the U.S. in various markets, various geologies, and pushing the equipment and the methodology to keep up with the demand.
The other big change that happened for you guys was the ownership that he put into place. I thought that's kind of an interesting path that he took, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, he was way ahead of the curve. He back in 1976 created an ESOP, and it was a relatively new concept of employee ownership. And for the longest time through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Berkel and Company was about 30% employee owned. And that was just a gift that he gave to the employees. And as he started to get up there in age and realized that, he was not going to be with Berkel for forever, despite his best intentions. He knew that he wanted the company to go on after his passing. And so he really pushed hard to make that happen. And he did that by passing the company on to its employees. So, we're proud to say since his passing, we're now 100% employee owned. And obviously we owe all of that to Charlie Berkel and his foresight. There's a lot more companies now that follow the ESOP model, but he was definitely one of the first to take that route and see it all the way through. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to actually see it all the way through. And he did.
Okay, just to shift gears a little bit, one question that I'm always curious about was, why do you feel that auger cast piling here in the U.S. typically uses grout, and then in European countries, almost everywhere else around the world, they're using concrete? Do you have a little maybe history or thinking of why that stayed that way? Or
I would say that probably stems from Mr. Berkel's own personal experiences coming up as a young engineer, and probably dates back to his days at Intrusion Prepack, because I know a lot of the work that he was involved in was dealing with grouting pre-placed aggregate. And so when you've got pre-placed aggregate for like bridge foundation repairs and things like that, you're typically pumping, a neat cement, grout mixture. And I think at the time when the original patent for the auger pile came out, before the hollow stem, you basically had to install a grout pipe adjacent to the hole, before there was anything like a hollowed stem auger. And so obviously you're not going to be able to pump concrete through a small diameter grout pipe. So I think his experience was with grout, and that's all we know. We've never done anything but pump grout in auger cast piles, but I think it all stems from his initial experience back in the day with intrusion prepacked.
Excellent. Well, listen, I really, again, appreciate you guys asking us to be the sponsor, and looking forward to hearing the rest of the story on that project too.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Sure.
Great to have you.
We are back from our sponsor break and ready to continue with our conversation with Greg Ryder of Berkel. Lucky had mentioned before the break that there were aligned goals between Berkel, the GC, and the DOT as far as Greg knew. In that spirit, Berkel offered an alternative to the DOT designed soil nail wall.
We all know that it takes some project time for an alternative to be considered. Was your alternative successfully selected? And then what happened? Can you elaborate on that, Greg?
Sure. So the short answer is yes. Our alternate design was selected and approved. The unfortunate part is I believe it took about 2 months for that to take place. During that same period of time, our client, the general contractor, had approached the railroad and was engaging them to see as a backup plan whether or not they would allow construction activities to take place on their property. But ultimately, the DOT did approve our design, but again, it took about 2 months. And so that was probably the beginning of when we started to sense that, the general contractor may have been under some pressure due to the length of time that it took to get the redesign approved, because I believe that at that point their schedule had already started. So some of their construction time, we came to realize, had been eaten up by this several months delay while the design was being contemplated.
Greg, I think some of our younger listeners who haven't been through this project probably don't realize that when you go in and offer either a value engineering alternative or and particularly a design build alternative, is that it takes a lot of time. It's not just a matter of the best idea wins, that the owner has to consider a lot of things other than just the design. They have to consider how the risks get rearranged. They have to consider about what happens if your design build alternative costs more or takes more time and those kind of things. So it's not unusual, is it, when you offer alternative for there to be a substantial amount of time taken for review?
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. I mean, the design itself has to be vetted from a technical standpoint. And then, as you alluded to, all the things that stem from utilizing that design during construction, those risks have to be evaluated by the owner as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. What Tim just mentioned, and Greg, it's never easy to get an alternative to be, different than what it was before, and get that approved by a DOT. That's even more difficult. Probably a private owner has a better say in, yes, I would like to do this, than a DOT, right? Who have their budget and who have their schedule to match. And GC is always looking at the time clock, right? How much bonus they can get at the end of it.
Right.
So, so you found out that there was a problem when the general contractor held the payment, right? Does it bother you personally when your client doesn't pay? You've been in this business for a very long time, and you are a seasoned veteran. But it seems like it would be hard not to be angry, at least to some degree, after working side by side with the general contractor, only to find out that they were quick to withhold payment, even though you have some relationship with them.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's possible to not personally get a little upset when somebody withholds payment after you feel like you've done a good job. Usually what happens is it's not right off the bat. Typically it takes us anywhere from 30 to 60 days to get paid on average anyway, so it's not immediate. But usually it's not uncommon for a project to have normal pay cycles at the beginning. And so you are lulled into thinking that everything's fine. And then maybe towards the latter half of the project, which is kind of what happened here, that's when the payments started to stop. And sometimes it's an owner related issue. Sometimes it's a client related issue. Typically we have a client in between us and the owner. And so you never know really what's holding up the payments. But yes, once you find out that the owner has paid the general contractor and then the general contractor is sitting on your payment, yeah, then it starts to become a little more personal.
Greg, so what justification did they give for withholding payment on you all?
Their justification was that due to delays with the shoring system, really it was two main things. One, it exposed them to liquidated damages because the end date, the finish date was not met. So the DOT was going to assess them liquidated damages. And the other schedule related issue was this pushed the road work that had to be done after the shoring work into the winter months. So you can imagine, once you get through mid-November here in the Midwest, you might have a few mild days every now and then, but it's not uncommon for things to get cold once you get into late November, December, and January. And doing asphalt paving during those months in the Midwest is usually not an option. So the client made the decision to switch to concrete paving, which brought along with it an increase in cost. So really the two drivers of their claim against us was liquidated damages and an increase in cost due to them having to switch the material used for the repaving of the road system.
So Greg, I understand that there was a contractual issue though, that in your contract, you had a construction duration and you met that, right?
Yes, we had a duration. We met it. We understood that at some point that the client, their schedule with the DOT was not the same. Their scheduled timing had started, months earlier, and so there was a disconnect there. But through the process, we still felt like, okay, this is the best way to go. The job's going to still finish on time. Our client offered to pay us premiums for bringing in crews to work weekends and extended hours, telling us that it was cheaper for them to do that than to be assessed LDs. And they wanted to build as much of a cushion into their schedule as possible. But yeah, ultimately there was a disconnect between the schedule that they contracted with Berkel versus the schedule that they contracted with the DOT to complete the work in.
Right. So the GC had a hard date with the DOT, but your contract with the GC was a schedule for completion, and it didn't have that same hard date.
Correct. A duration without any firm start date and end date. So basically, whenever we started, we owed them a construction duration of so many days from that point forward.
So Greg, after listening to everything that you were talking about in terms of how quickly miscalculation led to one thing led to the other, and at the end of it, general contractor decided to withhold the payment, right?
Mhm.
It's a very difficult situation to be with a contractor that you have worked with, and for some part you can actually trust, right? Did ever Berkel felt like they should have walked away, or if not, were there any steps that were taken?
No, we never felt like we should walk away. Our philosophy is, and I guess always has been, that you need to see the job through. Most of the subcontracts that we end up signing probably have verbiage in there that says we can't stop the job. So there's that. But philosophically, we've always believed that if we keep working hard and try and get the project done as quickly and as efficiently as possible, yes, there still may be an argument or a disagreement at the end of the project that's going to need to be resolved, some sort of dispute. But if we work as hard as we can while we're on the project, in theory, there should be less in dispute. And that's always good for everybody involved if you're arguing about a smaller sum of money than if you walked away from the middle of a project and then force the general contractor to bring in somebody new who's probably going to charge more money and maybe take longer to get up to speed. And so in that scenario, you're undoubtedly looking at a dispute for a much larger sum of money. So yeah, we never thought about walking away, but you definitely start dotting your I's and crossing your T's more because you know that you're potentially headed into a contractual dispute when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Greg. I think we can see the values of Berkel, right? Values of Berkel being in business for so long, and also with the passion that you have for every project that you work on and for the industry. I think that's great. For a subcontractor, was there a chance to avoid this ordeal by any chance?
Possibly. I mean, you're much smarter in hindsight, right, than you are at the beginning. Obviously, we did a postmortem as Tim mentioned, and probably the biggest thing was, had we really had a good idea of what the general contractor was up against schedule wise, and had we had an appreciation for the disconnect between the schedule that they signed us up for versus the schedule that they had with the owner, the DOT, that would have allowed us maybe to say, hey, let's just move forward with the DOT's design. We don't know how long it's going to take to get an alternate approved. And then the other side of it is not knowing, we're not road builders, so we don't have an appreciation for what work takes place after we're gone, right? So it's tough to say for sure that we could have avoided it. But yeah, at the end of the day, we proposed what we proposed, and we trusted that the general contractor was going to evaluate our proposal, be it the price, the schedule, the terms and conditions that came along with it, and do an assessment on their own as to whether or not it was a good fit to use Berkel for this project. Obviously, they did, so we believe that they still had that we were still the best option for them to complete this work.
So y'all didn't just say, hey, you're holding my payment, goodbye. You pursued getting the rest of the payment that they were holding, right?
Yeah, we tried the diplomatic approach first, and made several attempts to work it out and bring it to resolution. And those attempts were not successful. So we eventually filed for arbitration, as I think that was outlined in our contract as the specified dispute resolution method.
Why did you reach out in a diplomatic way? What reasons you brought that up specifically? What's your is that a strategy?
Because lawyers are very expensive. That's the simple answer. I mean, we're not we don't make a living taking people to court. We'd rather get an issue resolved and keep a client as happy as we can and go on to do work for them again. But sometimes you're just put in a position where that's not an option, and there's too big a gap between where you're at and where you need to be. And so that was one of these cases where the amount of money that they were looking to withhold was more than we were willing to stomach. So we had no choice but to file for arbitration. But yeah, you always want to try and settle things directly if you can. But if you can't, you have to do what you have to do sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really a long road that you had to go through. After going through this, would you say that you prefer arbitration or court settling? What do you think?
I'm a strong believer that for construction and engineering related disputes, that arbitration is the way to go. You have the ability to get an arbitrator on board that has construction and or engineering experience, so that they understand the concepts that are at play, as opposed to, you know, a jury of your peers that might not grasp some of the, you know, construction or engineering issues. So yeah, I'm a believer that if you have to go through a formal dispute resolution process, I mean, both sides benefit from the use of an arbitrator as opposed to a jury.
Greg, I've been through at least one arbitration, and in this case, I had 3 arbitrators, and they were very well versed. And I think both sides had to agree to those arbitrators. Is that the same case? Is that true in your case? Did you have 3?
We had 1, but I think that's the use of 3 is a common practice as well. But yeah, in this case, we had 1 arbitrator. But yeah, both sides get to provide input into who is selected. So it's, you know, it's designed to be a fair system, so that there's no bias on the part of the arbitrator that's ultimately chosen to oversee the proceeding.
And would this have been called binding arbitration?
Mhm.
I mean, so this was final.
Yep.
Well, tell us, our listeners now want to know, can you tell us a little bit of the results of the arbitration?
Yeah, so it was ultimately a win for Berkel. So the key element that the arbitrator found was that our client was free and clear to engage Berkel to provide, in this case, the excavation support system, and evaluate our schedule and price and terms and conditions against our competitors, and ultimately choose, you know, whichever subcontractor they believed best fit their approach to the job, irrespective of what contract terms they signed up for with the owner. So the key element to the dispute was the fact that as we discussed early, the GC had a firm start date and a stop date that didn't change. Yet they elected to contract with Berkel for a floating duration of so many days. And it was their right to do that, but it was also their risk to do that. So ultimately, everything boiled down in the arbitrator's mind to schedule all of the costs, whether it was liquidated damages or the premium for materials, all of that ultimately tied to a schedule delay issue. And so the arbitrator found in Berkel's favor. So we ended up winning the case.
Ah, that,
Thank God.
that's good to hear.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. I think this was such an amazing story, long road, but definitely a tough learning experience, I would say. I mean, we saw how you just started out as, having everything explained in terms of what your role was, what you were actually doing, and the schedule, budget, everything was so well explained until something had to go wrong, right?
Right.
That was just something that no one had anticipated. And even when some things went wrong, I mean, it was great to hear how Berkel stood their stand and didn't let go of any, the client's expectations or general contractors' expectations, and everything together. You made it work for them, right? You made it work for them, and then you provided a very good project success to them, in terms of how Berkel completely did the construction and handed it over to them right on time. And I loved the history lesson between Specrete and Berkel. And Charlie Berkel is definitely a passionate person who actually had a vision to see where Berkel should go after he left. That was wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Yeah, and it was Charlie Berkel's passion that would not allow us to walk away from a job midstream. It was in his DNA. Anybody that works here at Berkel knows that that's not an option, and it wasn't an option, and that all started with Charlie Berkel. So yeah, that's where that comes from.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's great. And also the differences, right, Tim? Like you have gone through the arbitration and you've heard so many stories of court settling, and it's really was great for our listeners. I think how Greg explained what the complications were in both sense and what made them win. So that was great.
Greg, thanks so much for sharing the story. As we close, I'd like maybe for you to share a little bit about the contract process for you, and how do you get, when you are working on a project and trying to get a contract in place, are there some indications that things are going well? And are there some indications things are going not well? And do you mind sharing those with us?
You mean in terms of just negotiating the contract initially, or through the execution of the work?
Well, I'll give you an example. So in what I find is that if folks are willing to talk about contracts early, it's better. And I just wanted to know if you had some kind of good practice or things that in history that you realize this is how to get the project off very well, as opposed to one that it sounds like it may be going to have some contract difficulties.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest thing is doing all the work up front and being detailed in the scope of work that you're agreeing to provide, the price that you're going to provide it for, and the time frame that you're going to provide it for. And that starts probably with a detailed proposal on the front end when you're in the bidding phase of the project. But But the reality is the proposal you submit is worthless after you submit it, unless you incorporate all of those items into the contract. And so that's where the disconnect, I think, can initially take place. If you outline, what you're going to do, how much you're going to charge for it, and how long it's going to take you to do, and the conditions that you'll perform the work in, if that doesn't make it into the contract, then your client doesn't truly understand what they're buying and what they're not buying, right? So it works both ways, but getting a good scope of work clearly defined in the contract so that you're clear on what you need to provide and that your client is clear on what they're buying is the key. Because if you start arguing about who is supposed to do what in the middle of the construction, at that point, it's much
It's too
harder to
late.
resolve. Yeah. So you might as well get it all out on the table before you get out in the field. And that's the best way to set it up to be successful, I believe.
I think so. That's been my experience as well. Although I'm not a contractor like you, but even in engineering, that's the case.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you for being here and sharing your story. And it was really great.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Greg.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcasts are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained, nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Proudly brought to you by our series sponsor, Peer Research, and today's episode sponsor, Speccrete. Thanks for your time. Keep on surviving.